Hey, guess what? This is kind of sort of the first official episode of Growing Up Punk. So I say kind of sort of the first official episode of Growing Up Punk because Aaron's not here. It's just me, David, and in a few moments here, you're going to hear my interview with a guy who's been on the show a couple of times back when we were known as Music to My Peers, and we're going to talk about his new album coming out. And I say his, I mean his band's. I'm going to be chatting with Matt from Junior about their new album, Beautiful Life. In just a few seconds here, you're going to hear that interview. But first, we got to get, that kind of housekeeping stuff out of the way. So if you want to follow us on social media, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Growing Up Punk. You can also find us, sorry, that's wrong. Instagram is at Growing Up Punk. Twitter is at Growing Punk Pod. And then you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at David Growing Up. And if you want to find Aaron on Instagram, at Aaron Grew Up Punk. They're all different. Would have been sweet if we could have got that all the same. But you know what? It's the way it goes, right? And also, wherever you're listening to the show, make sure, you subscribe, you give it a rating, a review, that kind of stuff, especially if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. That'll help get the show into more ears, especially if you leave a rating and a review. And yeah, just tell your friends about the show because we'd like to grow it. We're Growing Up Punk. We'd like to grow it. And if this is your first time listening, basically the show is this. We talk about music. Punk rock specifically, or stuff that falls under the punk rock umbrella. Our regular co-host of mine, Aaron, and myself, we both grew up listening to punk, so we tend to talk about, a lot of the stuff we grew up listening to as well as some new music. But anyway, without further ado, I don't want to waste any more of your time. This is my interview with Matt from Junior on Growing Up Punk. So this is your, I guess, third time being on the show, but it's technically your first because we just changed the name of the podcast from Music to My Peers to Growing Up Punk. And,
cool.
Yeah, so to lead that off, I'm going to ask you a question that's going to take you way back, I'm assuming, to when you were much younger. But do you remember what the first, punk band or punk album, anything that could be labeled that you listened to that got you into the music?
I mean, so it's kind of a loaded question because obviously for some people punk's quite sort of territorial in what sort of counts as punk. I mean, if we're sort of saying that, if we're talking about entry level, if I'm broadening the horizons, metal as well, and the sort of hardcore punk sort of metal-y sort of thing, very, very early on, one of my favorite bands was Avenged Sevenfold, really, really, but I remember just liking the sort of that they had like big choruses more than anything. I wasn't too bothered about it being like, you know, metal and, you know, like I remember hating the first record. We didn't do any singing, but and like, I mean, so they were like my first one, sort of like, let's say, sort of like rock entry level.
Sure.
But first punk, I mean, my dad is really into a lot of sort of British punk bands, so obviously like the Sex Pistols, but I remember he used to play Buzzcocks a lot, and I remember we went to go see Buzzcocks actually before Pete Shelley died, they were obviously one of the ones that were really sort of like influenced at the time. I just liked how they were like really melodic. At that sort of point in time, I wasn't really that bothered about like things being like, you know, super visceral and super heavy. It was more about like essentially just like what what counts as a pop song, but just like in a different mold. But so maybe so those sort of bands, I'd say, sort of the British ones. So
I mean, I was gonna say you would definitely have an advantage being from where you're from, of like being close access to some of those kind of bands. But that's going to see the Buzzcocks with you. How old would you have been?
That's a really good question. I mean, it was actually quite a lot later. that we actually went to go see him. I think I was like 13, 14, around that sort of age.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that sort of works out, so timeline-wise.
That's great.
But I remember it being really cool. I remember it being quite weird because it was. So I hadn't been to many gigs before that because it was actually quite late that I started going to gigs. Well, I don't really have much of a gauge of other people when they go to gigs, but I remember my first ever gig was like when I was like 11 or 12. And that was to go see Dragon Force, which is, there's first gigs and then there's going to watch Dragon Force, which is something completely, which is something, a little bit out there. But, I remember it being quite weird because, like, obviously at that show, the age demographic was quite, like, relatively young. And this, obviously, going to Buzzcocks, it was a lot older. Like, it was lots of sort of middle-aged punk rockers and that was quite a weird sort of, like, juxtaposition for me. But it was cool to see. It was a cool change of atmosphere.
Well, I mean, it's pretty obvious that you probably grew up with one of the coolest dads taking the Buzzcock shows. Yeah, that's awesome. So did that kind of hook you then, or is that just like as far as like punk is concerned, or was that just kind of the first that you sort of remember being introduced was through your dad?
Yeah, I mean, my dad's from Liverpool. My mum's from Wrexham, which is kind of close to Liverpool. So. The earliest band sort of I got into was the Beatles because my dad's just a massive Beatles fan, and I remember we like to this sounds super pretentious, but we like to analyze and dissect albums to the point where they're no longer enjoyable. But I remember doing that with all the Beatles records, I know back to front. I remember we used to go around, drive, and listen to it in the car and stuff. My dad used to tell me facts about the music and stuff. And I think that was the first sort of record, the first sort of artist where I was actually approaching it as sort of on an intellectual level, just as, instead of sort of an emotional level, trying to sort of pick apart how the songs work and stuff. But in terms of punk, I mean, it's a tough one because I want to sort of I don't know, it's probably bad that on listing my punk records, I started off with Avenged Sevenfold and then going into pop punk, which is probably the two cardinal sins. But I mean, I obviously a lot of the sort of pop punk bands of the sort of early 2000s were very sort of gateway bands. So I remember obviously loving Blink-182 and Bone for Soup and all the sort of generic ones that you would go through when you're a moody teenager.
Sure.
And it wasn't until a lot later that I saw getting into more sort of hardcore punk bands, but because I remember for a solid of the sort of new school hardcore bands, I remember for a solid 2 years or maybe a year, I wouldn't listen to anything else apart from Comeback Kid because I just I kind of sort of there was sort of a dip where I was sort of I was enjoying pop punk, but it wasn't really doing it for me, and I wanted something a little bit more visceral. And so Blink is the obvious one that sort of started it all off. I'd say. But
Comeback Kid, those are some good Canadian boys.
Well, so Canadians do punk better than Americans.
So you get an extra point for that one.
Oh, nice.
There you go. Cool. Well, I mean, we said kind of on this show, we talk about punk, punk rock under the umbrella of punk rock, and you mentioned things like pop punk and obviously hardcore punk and more traditional old school punk. It doesn't matter. I listen to it all, right?
For sure. Just before I forget as well, I remember there was actually a couple of Canadian bands at the time who I was really into. One of my favorite bands for a very, very long time, it still is. I sort of appreciate them is Billy Talent.
Sure.
And I used to always find that really funny when I was younger. You sort of see them through they were emo band inverted commas before we sort of, before listening to Sunny Day Real Estate and seeing wow, these guys are actually sad. But but I remember, but then when you see interviews with Billy Talent and bands like them and bands like My Chemical Romance, just none of them refer to themselves as emos. We see ourselves like a punk band. We're just a punk band, and later on I sort of learned to appreciate they were just essentially a punk band. I mean, obviously his high pitched vocals and but they were just they were obviously really influenced by their old school punk records, and they just did it in their own way, which I always think is admirable in itself.
Well, it's interesting to me that you because I don't think I ever really thought of Billy Talent as an emo band, because when I heard them, what they actually reminded me of was a more really quite polished, maybe watered down a little bit version of At the Drive-In.
Yeah, well,
like,
yeah.
The chaos that came with that music, right? Like
yes,
they kind
definitely.
of refined that a little bit. And actually, recently, this is I don't know how into going on YouTube and watching live performances you are, but like how into it you are. But a few months ago, Billy Talent actually they went on a YouTube show thing called House of Strombo. So,
is that when they didn't cover Balls on Parade?
Yes, that's what I was going to talk about. Yeah, when they covered Rage Against the Machine. Yeah,
and they did. What did they do? Did they do Bulls on Parade?
Yep, it was Bulls on Parade.
Or did they just do Bulls on Parade?
I think it was just Bulls on Parade. But I was like, when they said they were going to cover this Rage Against the Machine song, immediately I was like, oh, I don't know about this.
Yeah, alarm bells go off, don't they?
Yeah, but I thought they pulled it off pretty well, to be fair.
They did, but unfortunately for them, I don't know if you saw, but Denzel Curry did a version of Bulls on Parade as well.
Yeah, no, I didn't see that.
And he does it on like a version, the Triple J, I think, that, and he absolutely smashed it and did this like incredible rendition. Yeah. And like it was no fault of Billy Talent. It was obviously like guitar tonality was perfect and stuff because I can't remember the guitarist's name. I feel like I know it's Ben who's the singer, but I can't remember what guitarist is called. But his tones and his guitars always sound incredible. And the amount of stuff he can do just on one guitar, but like. So that side of it was completely covered, but like, yeah, it was awesome. But it was just because in my mind I just recently seen that Denzel Curry version, which you should definitely check out if you get a chance because it's great.
Yeah, but it was this really neat sort of moment because, like you mentioned, Billy Talent, and then House of Strombo, the guy who hosts it essentially, because they're house shows that he puts on at his own house. He's like
that's sick.
Yeah, he's like a Canadian alternative / hard music sort of like. Icon in a sense. Like he was the guy on. We had, I mean, when MTV was a thing, we had Much Music here in Canada, and so it was,
cool.
Canada's response to MTV, and he hosted a number of like the sort of alternative shows. George Strombolopoulos is his name. He was just great.
Awesome, great name. What
right.
That's
so
awesome.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, well, another cool thing about that as well, because I remember it being like sort of like a house show, because like house shows over here isn't really a thing. Like they are,
right?
But it's nowhere near as like big of a deal as it is in like America and Canada, where like some of the best shows, like the most memorable sort of shows have been like house shows. Like even in like the pop punk sphere, even when Neck Deep went over to America, they basically got signed off the back of doing those crazy house show tours, and like so I wish that was sort of over here. I wish that was more of a thing over here.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a huge thing over here. Like, I mean, obviously for bands that are kind of getting going and just like looking for places to play, they definitely exist. I've seen like the odd, kind of actual touring musician. I don't know if you're familiar with the band Pedro the Lion at all.
No, I don't think I am.
Yeah, kind of like an indie emo sort of thing from Seattle area. But anyway, he was just touring solo at one point, and I saw him play a house show, which I thought was great because it was like one of my favorite songwriters, Dave Bazan is his name, like one of my favorite songwriters of all time, and I get to see him, with 50 other people in a house show. That was pretty crazy. But
that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's so cool.
So
that's so rad.
Yeah, let's talk about the new record that you guys have got coming out. That's why we're doing it. It's great to just chat.
Yeah, but it's also fun to talk about punk as well. So
yeah, and we'll kind of segue in a little bit because the new record that you got coming out in a few weeks here is called Beautiful Life, and I just wanted to ask, was there anything kind of like over the course of putting this record together that maybe you were listening to or reading or watching that was influencing you, or did you lock yourself away in a cabin?
Well, what I will say is, for starters, this has been like the recording and sort of construction of this album has been the longest process. It's been about like 2 years of just back and forth, and some of it's like unavoidable because it's things like obviously Mark with his wrestling schedule.
Sure.
It does like make like solid chunks of time being somewhere in a studio quite difficult, but like we just there were so many elements to it that we just had to get right, and we did it all ourselves. We did it independent, and like we did things like we recorded like a choir, a kids choir, and like we had to go and there was a really cool school near us where we went and just like recorded the choir there, and like so it was just like such a long process. So what I would say is that like I tend to listen to an album to death in like sort of very short bursts. So I'll spend like 3 weeks just listening to one album, essentially picking it apart and sort of analyzing it, and then I'll sort of move on to something else. But there were lots of sort of like there was loads of bands that sort of went into the sort of into the whole thing. I think initially, because we were thinking sort of big concept album when we started, lots of the sort of like Black Parade, American Idiot was sort of like, we wanted that scope in terms of like, you know, that sort of like stadium rock sort of sound. And like, it's funny with the songs that we've released so far, it's almost not like a red herring, but we haven't fully shown what's like, you know, behind the curtain about what, you know, what is actually on there, because a lot of it is very, very sort of like, so almost like glam rock, stadium rock influence as opposed to like pop punk. It's definitely probably our furthest thing away from pop punk. So that was sort of like the initial influence in those records, but as well, like Queen was a huge influence on the sort of like almost like the storytelling and the structure of the sort of songs. Like, right. I always loved how obviously you have someone like Freddie Mercury who's such like an incredible musician and such like a massive personality, but also the songs that the frameworks of the songs that, you know, he's working to are incredible as well. They're written like classical songs.
Yeah.
And but they're almost like so generous with melody. There's so much to unpack in, you know, if you like Don't Stop Me Now, and like obviously things like Bohemian Rhapsody, but even like You're My Best Friend, there's so much to unpack sort of like sonically. So like that was also like a really, really big influence. But like, yeah, as the album went on, there were kind of like different things that sort of like went into the sort of influence of making it. It was funny because like I'm such like a control freak, and I'm such like I never feel like it's done, that we'll get to a point and I'll be like, I'll listen to like a Queen record, and I'll go, okay, we've got to go back and change this thing because I heard this thing on this one record and it'd be so sick if we did this in our own way.
Right.
But then like, you know, like there's still like a bit of Blink in there as well, but more sort of their latter sort of discography in the sort of a little bit more conceptual and a bit bigger scope, because I'm really big on like the latter. Well, they're sort of, I suppose now it's their middle period.
Right.
Like, I really like Neighborhoods. I think that's a great record, and I remember that being quite a big influence at the beginning. So yeah, like lots of stuff really, sort of went into it, but it was definitely sort of big sound was what we were looking for, like almost like, you know, wall of sound, but yeah, big scope. So yeah.
So yeah, you mentioned a number of things in it that I want to ask you about in a minute, but first, you talked about how long it took to put this record together, and I mean, Day of the Dead, that was a song that you released as a single. You know, like, it seems like forever ago now. I don't. it probably wasn't.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, but so, you know, when you recorded and released that song, were you actually in the process of doing the, you know, like, was Beautiful Life a thing that was in the works, or did it kind of? Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, we recorded drums for pretty much the whole record by that point. We did it in a really weird order, basically. We did it back to front, where we did bass guitar first with electronic drums, then we did drums.
Oh, okay.
And then we did it that way. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but it was actually an absolute nightmare. But at that point, we'd done like sort of initial version of drums, but then obviously like, when we wanted to put something out, we were like, we want to work on Day of the Dead properly. So we sort of set everything else aside and finished that up.
Gotcha.
And then we went back and sort of like redid a lot of bits. Like some songs were cut out because it just didn't really, we liked them, but they didn't quite feel, you know, strong enough. So we just thought it was better to be like, because I've always preferred like a tighter album package than like, you know, just lots of songs. But so like, it was funny because Day of the Dead, it was almost like, in terms of like very, very basic structure of how it was written, was one of the sort of latter songs to be written for the record, but it just so happened that it ended up being the first one that came out because a lot of it changed as we went on. So we. Well,
I was gonna say, did you record, like, start the process with, you know, bass to electric drums? Was that done because of like Mark's schedule, or what was the thought process behind that?
Yeah. So it was initially because of Mark's schedule, because we knew he was away for a big chunk of time, and if we got it down, then it would almost give us this sort of incentive to finish it. But the problem is that like, I mean, like, it sounds super pretentious that like talking about like, you know, like a vibe or a feeling of songs, but like for drums to like lock in with guitars, it's quite hard to do it in reverse. Like, you usually start with the drums for a reason. Like the drums, the bass and guitar sort of lock in. We were very, very lucky that Cy, our drummer, is like incredible, and he made it work and really feel it anyway. But it was a little bit difficult to sort of lock into. And like that's why it was so difficult, because like we record the drums and they sound great, but then you listen back and be like, oh, those guitars we recorded don't quite work now with this new structure. So we almost had to like not scrap it completely, but we definitely had to go back and change a lot to make it work. So it was almost like it kind of backfired on us doing it that way, but it's, you know, it's whatever. It helped us, you know, start the ball rolling, which is the important bit. So yeah.
Did you record this, like, were you at a studio? I know you do production work of your own, or were you at another studio working with other people, or were you just doing this on your own? So, you know, going back and maybe changing some bass parts after the drums were kind of done. Was that a big hassle, or could you just kind of do it on your time?
So it was so basically all the demoing and, you know, pre-production I did, and we did in just my house. But then we've got a really good friend called Tim Vincent, he's called, and he recorded the record, and he has a studio literally like 10-15 minutes away from us. And it was funny, when we did like Juniorland, we recorded that up in Sheffield, which is about like 3 or 4 hours away. So like, you know, we had to commit to that, and we stayed up there, and like whatever we recorded in that moment in time, you know, that's what we had, and there's no going back. Which I remember we really didn't like at the time, which was one of the main reasons why we went to Tim, because we knew that Tim was around the corner. So if we wanted to make any changes, then we could just literally call him up and be like, "Hey, do you mind if we just do this?" Within reason, obviously, because the guy's got to, you know, live. But it was, yeah. So what happened was essentially is we booked like a big slot of time with Tim. That's a lot of T's in that sentence. A lot of time with Tim. Anyway, we booked a big spot. And then we do it in little sort of like bursts and go back for like 2 or 3 days and make some amendments, 2 or 3 days again. And there would be times where like all the production, so like the synths and stuff I do here, and then Tim would import it into his project and then sort of mix it into the project, which was good because it meant that, like, you know, for times where Tim was busy, there was still stuff to do, but it did make it sort of like a little bit fractured in that, like, obviously there was so much going on in so many different places, but like luckily, because he's awesome, he's so good at what he does, and you know, it helped having him so close, and we were already friends before recording, that he got what we were going for, and like he was really into the project, and like it meant that we'd come with him and be like, hey, do you mind if we just stick some strings on this now? And then he'd be like, yeah, sure, no worries. And then we could do that. So really beneficial that we did it that way.
Right on. So you had mentioned Juniorland there, and you also mentioned, you know, a few minutes ago about being influenced by albums like American Idiot and Black Parade, and then influences from Queen and all that kind of stuff. Like with, you know, like rock operas or what have you. Is there with Juniorland, you know, there was a bit of a recurring theme throughout the record. And then, you know, mentioning, like I said, Black Parade and stuff like that. Is there like a theme that works its way through this record at all, or is it just kind of a collection of songs that you wanted to flow from point A to point B?
No, there's definitely a theme. So I like to think, so Juniorland was quite introspective. It was very much sort of about our own experiences, I'd say, in that, like, it was about when I moved to uni, and I moved to university, and Mark was moving to America to wrestle, and like it was a very not turbulent time, but it was like there was lots going on, big changes in our lives, and like it felt that the music sort of came naturally as a sort of, you know, as a byproduct of that. So it was a lot more introspective, and like it was about like home was one of the central themes, whereas like Beautiful Life, it still has that, and that like there's lots of our own experiences in there as well, but it's more so about the other people's perspectives and how, like, I suppose the best way to describe it was we wanted to understand the experience of people who don't feel comfortable in their own skin, whether they're having trouble, you know, understanding their identity or their, you know, gender, or like lots of sort of gender politics issues made its way into this record, because it's obviously we are all you know, strong advocates for feminism in our band. And like, you know, I feel very strongly about those sort of issues. We've got friends who obviously, you know, identify as different genders and stuff, and seeing the sort of like backlash from people who don't fully understand or want to take in that sort of like how those kind of people live, and what the negative sort of effects it has on them and how uncomfortable it makes them feel. We wanted to sort of like, that was kind of almost the basis of being like, we want to sort of like say, like, you know, we want to be open with these people as possible and be like, look, this is a positive album. It's about appreciating like the beautiful things in life, and you should be happy just how you are. Whatever you want to be, you be that, and don't let anyone sort of put you against that or like make you feel like you have to feel a certain way. If you want to, if you want to identify as this, or if you want to feel a certain way, you do it, because like only you can live your life. So it was about appreciating the smaller things in life that make it sort of beautiful, which is sort of like the concept, really. I'd say it's sort of like a broad, and it covers lots of sort of different issues in the record, because like there's things like I don't know if you know over there what happened with Grenfell Tower over in London, where a tower block was burned down of flats, and it was a really big issue, because the government which we have at the moment basically was completely useless, and lots of people suffered, and it was a very, very, very difficult time for lots of disprivileged people. And it was, so there's lots of sort of like kind of sort of political leanings on this record as well. So yeah, it covers quite a lot of ground. It's not quite as like centrally themed as Juniorland was, and that that sort of level of introspective. It covers a lot more issues, but the center, the most important bit remains, and that like feeling comfortable in your own skin and just being yourself, which sounds lame, which sounds like sort of an after school special, but like it's important, we feel it's important. So yeah. Sorry, that was quite long-winded.
No, it's good. So, I mean, we don't have like a central character or story that's working through this album, just more, I guess, a collection of stories or whatever that you feel are important for people. So, so looking back to the song "Day of the Dead," for instance, is that a song because it's written from a first-person perspective? So, is that a song that is from personal experience, or is it just another one of those things where you wrote it from a first-person perspective, but it's kind of maybe inspired by someone else's story?
Well, so that one is probably the most introspective of them all. Like, that is a sort of direct personal experience. Yeah. So like that, I kind of wanted to deliberately blur the lines between what is like actually from my perspective or from our perspective collectively, or if it's like what we've observed, because like it's almost like who it comes from shouldn't really matter if it's like an issue which we feel like is very, very important, and it's like we don't want people to be turned off if they feel like it's not, because obviously people want to relate to songs. Like when you listen to an artist, you want to feel like I feel like that too, and it's quite hard to gauge whether if it's coming from your perspective or you're telling someone else's story, whether people want to engage with it more or less. So I think if you keep it deliberately vague, then people just take it as face value and are able to sort of like be able to relate to it easier if they are going through that experience themselves. And it almost feels a little less disingenuous as well, because because I know that like we thought a lot about these sort of themes and issues and these people's experiences, but like it can sometimes be difficult to sort of translate that. So if everything is a bit sort of vague, I feel like people are more comfortable with sort of digesting it.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the music video for Playing the Part? Because it's a pretty great video.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can you just share a bit, I guess, how that sort of came together, whose idea it was and whatnot for the concept?
So yeah, for sure. So basically, we spent a long time doing Day of the Dead at the time. It was only a short video shoot, but it was quite intense. Like we had to do the storyboard, like the theme and like what it looked like, and then the performance shots. And the performance shots were quite taxing, because that room was like 1,000,000 degrees, and it was a really hot day. And I remember just feeling like we'd be 3 or 4 hours in, and I was like, this is the worst. And it was so the whole video process was quite like intense. So this video, we weren't actually there at the time, and we needed a video. So we called up our friend Alex Bull, who's filmed our other videos. He didn't film Day of the Dead, but he filmed like Fall to Pieces, and he did Veronica. Okay. And we said to him, look, this is the theme of the album. This is space is obviously, in terms of like what aesthetically, space has obviously played quite a big theme. Yeah. We were happy. We trust your judgment. And just if you have any ideas. And he came up with the idea and was like, oh, why don't we go around all the places in Cardiff and like have this, astronaut helmet, because like it's sort of like you know, and just like someone dancing in the street and doing what they want, because it's kind of like sort of representation of being like, you know, don't worry what other people think of you around you, as long as you're happy in yourself, and like, you know, just be joyous in that. And we thought it was really, really cool. It was a really like, it was really like off the cuff for him as well. He just sort of thought it up very, very quickly. And he's got such an eye for detail that we knew that when he came to recording the shots, he'd really, really be able to do it justice. So we couldn't have been happy with how it turned out, to be honest. And so we almost can't really take any credit for that. That was all Alex's work. And he interpreted it himself and made something really, really cool.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'll say thank you, Alex, because it's totally like this video where, you know, you put it on and you kind of can't help but smile and feel good, right? Like, but
yeah, well, that was the thing. We wanted it to be sort of like joyous,
yeah,
because like, you know, the album is supposed to be like joyous. I mean, there's obviously like heavy bits on it,
yeah,
and there's like sad bits, but it's a happy album. It's a celebration of existing.
Yeah.
So, you know, that we wanted that to sort of come across, and luckily he smashed that.
So where did the space theme sort of thing come from? Because, yeah, you mentioned like the aesthetic, you know, and kind of updating the logo and all that kind of stuff. But then obviously with the record itself, the cover is a kid wearing an astronaut suit, right? So
yeah, totally.
Yeah,
so,
where did that come from?
Well, yeah, well, I mean, like, once the lawsuit between me and Tom DeLonge, you know, was settled, and he said that I couldn't take any more Angel Airways like this, no. So, like, for me, like, in this instance, space, it was a really funny, we tried to, everything sort of comes back to sort of like the central theme of the record, and like, I remember when one of the songs that came out afterwards, so Don't Know What I Do, was sort of like, I feel like it sort of encapsulates as the best, and that like, when I was sort of thinking about the sort of space theme and stuff, is that like, I imagine that when you're like, the best way I can sort of describe or like try and articulate what it feels like when you've either like lost someone or gone through something which is really traumatic, whether it's like suffering with, you know, going through a very depressive phase. It's very isolating, it's very lonely, and like to me it feels like sort of being like lost in space, like it's this empty chasm of, you know, just nothingness, and it can be very lonely and isolating, but everything around you is actually like incredible. Like, you know, space is one of the most mind-blowing sort of, you know, phenomenons that we've ever experienced. And like, you know, it's hard to appreciate that when you feel like you're going through your roughest time. But then the idea of being like rescued and like, you know, there's still being a light on the horizon. That idea of sort of like hope is really sort of like interwoven into sort of lots of sort of space, not culture, but like space media, you know, like whether it's like in like films or in like music, and like, so yeah, for me it was more sort of like a thematic thing as opposed to like an aesthetic thing, but it just so happened that we're all really big on that sort of aesthetic anyway, so, and everything just kind of fell into place really as a result of that.
So I don't know if you can answer this question or not, but was like with Mark's ring attire, he kind of, you know, brings in sort of like using the NASA font and stuff, like, was that all done together sort of thing, or was it just purely coincidental that, you know, everyone just happened to like sort of space stuff?
Well, it was one of the, I don't want to put words in this map, I think I genuinely think it was just because we all kind of like space in our own sort of like in our own sort of way, and I mean that predates the record being put together. And I know Mark is really big on like sort of like space imagery anyway, and like because like obviously like with high flying is sort of like part of his monkey with his wrestling, and it was sort of like the next evolution of that. And if I remember rightly, I think it sort of predates it, but like it was weird. I don't think it was like when he went to that, he was like, oh, let's do an album about space because you've done a space gimmick with wrestling, and it wasn't like, oh, you know, we've got an album about space, so you should do a space gimmick with your wrestling. It was genuinely, everything just sort of happened in tandem. It was quite peculiar, but it was cool. Everything sort of fell into place.
I think I just happened to notice it around the same time, probably because, you know, the junior stuff with the space cadets and all that, and all of a sudden,
well, that once everything sort of fall into place, we did then try to sort of merge the two lanes basically, because it made sense. It'd be stupid not to, you know, not to be like, because like, and Mark started wearing like the junior logo on his jacket and things like that, you know. It's it was just cool. It was a cool thing to be able to embrace, because you should have fun with it, you know what I mean? Like, music is about having fun, enjoying yourself. So
for sure,
and so is wrestling, because it's just another art form. So yeah.
So back to the record though, as we kind kind of diverged a little bit there.
That's right.
So, like, I know you talked earlier about, Beatles records and absolutely just, like, listening to them and breaking them down, this and that and what have you. Does something like sequencing, like track sequencing, how big of, kind of a role or whatever does that play for you when putting a record together? Are you very meticulous about going, this is an opener?
It's the biggest deal.
Yeah.
It's the biggest deal. It was the most stressful process that I think more so than any sort of like part that we've done, of the record was the track listing, because it makes such a massive difference. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I'm trying, because like, just the way things are structured, obviously, like, people know that, like, the first song and the last song, obviously, like, the bookends of a record, but there's so many different aspects that go into, like, a record's track listing. Like, one of my favorite records of all time is OK Computer by Radiohead.
Sure, yeah.
And, like, Airbag, which opens the record, and The Tourist, which closes the records, they make perfect sense. And then, like, Electioneering being a later point, there's so many things go into it, like even to do with like pacing. Like, you don't want it to drag, you don't want it to sag. And I always hate it when records, and you can't help it a lot of the time, and people probably people still might say this about our record, but I hate listening to a record and the first half is like great and full with all the singles, and then you get to the second half and it sags, and you feel you feel the fatigue. And they managed to pull it back maybe like the last song or whatever. Like, I feel like you have to evenly distribute like your songs, the ones you feel are the strongest throughout the album. And we thought, long and hard about this track listing. We knew the only things that were definite was the first song and the last song, and that was literally it. And everything else had to sort of fall into place naturally. And I think the track listing changed. Like, literally, we were doing the artwork for the CD, and they were like, "Oh, what's the track listing?" And then we had a change of mind, and then sent it off. So I think literally the only reason it stayed how it was, was because we had to send it off for print. So yeah.
Finally, it was like, okay, we got to set this in stone.
We got no choice now. There's literally no choice.
How entertaining could it be though if you have a track listing for the CD, a track listing for like the like digital streaming, just because there you kind of free form if you want, or so
don't tempt me.
Yeah.
Don't tempt me.
I'm just gonna keep changing it.
Yeah, I do it. Give me more opportunities to change it.
Right. But this does lead into my next question though, with sequencing, because there is a vinyl release for this album. So how much thought goes into sequencing an album when you're just putting it up digitally or on CD, where it's like, okay, this is plays start to finish, there's no interruptions, versus sequencing for a record where halfway through or roughly thereabout it's going to have to be flipped over?
Yeah, so there was a decision made. We knew what the halfway point or like the vinyl flip moment was going to be.
Right.
There's a song in it called Baby Blue, which is essentially we tried to write a song like Hey Jude, being like just like super anthem-y song, big around the piano. Cool. Just almost like a repeating chorus that closes out the track, basically. It was just this big, bombastic, silly song. And like, it almost like, because we tried to aim so high in terms of like scope, but like if we tried to, it feel like it needed a bit of a breather before going to something else, or otherwise it would just feel like it would feel like how a Muse album feels like sometimes. So I love Muse, they're one of my favorite bands, but where like, they keep on adding things. They keep on adding like more strings, more this, that, and that, and eventually you reach a ceiling where like nothing like surprises you or nothing like excites you, because like if you've got like space orchestras going on, then there's nothing. Where do you go from there? Yeah. Whereas like I feel like if you have a good respite in the middle and then follow up with a song which is maybe the complete opposite of that last song, you can kind of like save the pace and like keep things interesting. So yeah, we thought about the vinyl flip, and luckily, because obviously, like with vinyl, like timings, because they've got to fit it onto the grooves, like luckily it did work out where we could do it how we wanted to. But that could have been disastrous if I didn't get my way. Yeah,
I'm excited to hear it, because like that's the thing. Like with vinyl, a lot of times when I listen to a pressing, sometimes it doesn't really matter, right? Like it's just kind of like okay, it's a collection of songs. But when an artist puts like that thought into closing side A, you can definitely pick up on that, I feel. So I'm
especially, I find it interesting when we're in the sort of like post-vinyl era. Like obviously now people buy vinyl for like the sentimental value or just to sort of support the artist. But like obviously, technically vinyl should play no part in your sort of like your structure of your track listing. But I find it really interesting when you see, like you said, when you see artists who do, because it seems really weird. It's like, oh, you didn't need to do that, but you did. So it's kind of made me appreciate it more. And I feel like an album does benefit from that, because like there's a reason. Well, no, the reason is because obviously you can only fit so many songs onto one side, but like, lots of records were structured like that back in like the 60s and 70s. So
Well, and that's why I brought up, you mentioned dissecting the Beatles and Queen and stuff like that, and like artists who that would have been, their main focus for what a release looked like. And and sometimes it's interesting because like listening even to a digital, like stream on Apple Music, Spotify, whatever, you can kind of hear sometimes either I'm listening going, oh, that'd be a great place to end side A,
totally.
whether or not that's intentional or not. It's an interesting sort of thing that we get because, with CDs and with digital streaming, that's not as big of a deal, right? Like you just hit play and 35, 40 minutes later, you've reached the end.
Yeah, well, I like to think, like we say, I like to think that like, artists do think about it. Yeah. And like, it's one of those things where like you get like artists who, leave things very, very interpretive to almost like let their sort of fan base fill in the gaps. And whether that's like them, just sort of doing that for the sake of doing it, or whether it's like it's an intentional decision. But like, I like to think that artists think about it more than sort of they let on, because like you listen to some, like you said, and you're like, that is where side A ends. Yeah. That is where, and then you go on side B, you can just tell straight away.
Yeah, yeah. There you go. Well, I wanted to ask you one last sort of thing. Are there any, with this record, Beautiful Life, are there any like Easter eggs or moments kind of that you're like, this is you just smile or whatever when you hear it or think of it?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, so we're big on like intertextual references and Easter eggs in our songs. And like there are a few in there. Yeah. It was funny because like obviously Juniorland was such like a long process. Like we rode Juniorland for so long, but what was essentially a long EP. We had the initial release, and then we did the deluxe edition with the extra songs on it that were recorded in the sort of the interims. And like we tried to make like a whole world around that. Juniorland trying to be this sort of like physical manifestation of a place. And there was lots of things like in the video for like House is Not Quite Home, it's that is Lakeside, that's where around where we live and stuff, there was very, very like that. I think that what you'll see initially on the surface is lots of sort of like intertextual references within itself of the record. Like you get like you'll get some references to like other songs on the record. Right. There's a couple of like sneaky ones that like if you're like a hardcore Junior fan, you'll listen to and go, oh, that's a reference to like some of their earlier stuff. Yeah. But you'll just have to wait and see. You'll have to wait and see. Yeah, for sure. But what I can tell you is there's lots of moments that make me smile just because like it was just a nice process to do, and even though it was really stressful, I loved every minute of it. So. Well,
and I like that in that you brought up Juniorland, because obviously there's like the straight up lyrical copy and paste from one song to another, right? But
that was just because we ran out of lyrics now.
Well, and that was honestly on Juniorland. It was the first moment where I went, okay, what's going on this record? Because clearly you're now linking two songs directly. And so it was just kind of this neat thing. It reminded me a little bit of how the Wonder Years closed out The Greatest Generation, where they literally take lines from like every song.
That was such like a influence. That was like, I mean, we were, but Mark is probably the biggest Wonder Years fan. Oh, well, I mean, we're all massive Wonder Years fans, but like obviously that record came out, and like I feel like no other pop punk record could compete. I mean, like you obviously had the Stories of Fathers stuff doing their thing, and like you had 4 Year doing their thing, and, but like Greatest Gen is just like, to me, is the sort of like the best Wonder Years record. And like like you said, I mean, they're big on it anyway. They always like sort of do intertextual references in their songs. And when they did even in what's it called, it's Passing Through a Screen Door, when he does like referencing Me vs. the Highway, and their old songs is such a cool thing. And that played a big part in Juniorland, I think.
Well, it reminds me, I don't know, like this might be going kind of off the map a little bit, but in a sense it reminds me of, I grew up loving Kevin Smith movies. All the Jay and Silent Bob movies, and there was always like references between those movies that tied them all together, right? And without being like, oh, this is a direct sequel. Obviously, down the line there were eventually direct sequels, but in those first batch of movies, it was just that they took place in the same universe, as it were. So I like those like cross references here and there, or even I guess more a more modern sort of or like like current sort of example would be like the Marvel movies, right? Like,
well, this is the thing, is that like obviously Kevin Smith is obviously a massive comic book fan, and I always feel like intertextual reference is such a big comic book trope.
Sure,
that, like, he obviously translates that into his films, and like obviously now we're in such a different climate now, and that like it's obviously cool to like comic book films, like, you know, the Marvel universe, the MCU is like the biggest film franchise ever. But, like, you know, it was almost like, I like to think that intertextual references sort of giving back to sort of like people who are really into that sort of like that project, whether it's like a comic book or a film or an album, you know, and it's like people want to celebrate it on the same level that you feel, you know, that you enjoy it as well. So like I think that, and I think he's great for that, Kevin Smith. I think that, and I think that hopefully that sticks around, and, you know, people still do it, because I think it's great. Yeah, no, it's and I'm looking forward to hearing that kind of, you know, like translating in your music and whatever. Just I love being able to sit down. I'm sure I'm definitely not the only one, but sit down and listen and go, oh wait, that's what he's talking about here and here, or whatever, you know, like that's kind of neat, tying it all together. So man, looking forward to the new record, and thanks for taking the time. Much. Yeah, thanks for taking the time to sit down and chat about it. Hey, it's no worries. I'm happy to do it anytime you want.